Before last class ended, before the spring break, we were discussing socialization as well as stratification. Those were chapters 4 and 7. You had an assignment to do that was related to the Opportunity Atlas, where you were to look up the demographics for certain areas and then write your feelings based on the specifics that were in the assignment. During our last class, we got into a discussion about gender. I had asked you a question about Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union's child. And there was a lot of talk back and forth about your views, what you felt was right, what you felt was wrong. And that conversation tied into socialization. Did we feel that Dwayne Wade was doing right by his child? And did we feel that at the young age of 13 or 14 that his child had the right to choose how they felt more comfortable? So based on that discussion, I felt like we should jump right into chapter 8 on gender. In this chapter, not only are we going to talk about gender, we're also going to talk about sex and sexuality. And we're going to discuss how all of this ties into society. Many of you may feel that there is really no difference between gender and sex. So when we're talking male versus female, is that gender or is that sex? Well, as defined here, sex is a biological concept and it's determined on the basis of primary sex characteristics. There are also secondary sex characteristics. Those are physical traits that are not essential in reproduction. So it would be things like the quality of your voice, the distribution of your facial hair or body hair. And then gender is described as a social distinction based on culturally conceived and learned ideas about appropriate appearance, behavior, and or emotional characteristics. And there are different mental or emotional characteristics for males and females according to society. Transgender and cisgender describe people who, if you're transgender, your gender does not correspond to your birth sex. If you're cisgender, it describes people whose gender corresponds with their birth sex. So, if we go back to the example of Dwayne Wade's child, I believe that that would fall under transgender because that child did not feel as if they corresponded with their birth sex. Intersexual people are people whose bodies have both female characteristics. So how would society handle that? And would the parent or the doctor be able to choose the child's sex? And actually, going back and looking at this, intersexual is people whose bodies have both female and male characteristics. So intersex activists, and I know that they talk about this briefly in your book, but according to the intersex activists, parents and surgeons push to assign a sex to a genital ambiguous child because of social discomfort and fear. So this takes you back to socialization. If you are not comfortable in your own skin, per se, then you will not be comfortable in society. It's typically harder to denaturalize the dominant category because the dominant category is seen as the normal or as the norm, and it's often invisible. Many people in our society take for granted that sex has only two categories and tends to ignore facts that suggest sex itself is socially constructed, which results in the exclusion of those who don't fit neatly into one category or the other. In other words, society feels that you're either male or you're female. If you don't relate to either one of those, then you don't fit into our society. Here's something that you can think about. Sex determination of athletes. The NCAA determines the sex of athletes by their hormone levels. So do you think that's fair? And if so, why? And I guess the question that I have about it is, if you want a competitive edge, people do take hormones. So if you are a female and you're taking a hormone and it's giving you more testosterone so that you're now leaning more towards male, do you feel like that gives you a fair competitive advantage if you are born a female? You're taking hormones that produce more testosterone, which is a male hormone. Therefore, if we look at the NCAA rules, then you as a woman, because your hormone level is higher, you should be competing with the males. What do you think about that? Do you think there's a better way to determine where an athlete should be running or playing or jumping? But what are your thoughts? Now, there is that fluid notion of sex-gender identity, and it can get tricky. Like we were just talking about athletes. So let's take it back to the campus and campus sports. So based on a policy at Bates College, which is fairly typical of the NCAA, it says a transgender athlete should be allowed to participate in any sport activity so long as that athlete's use of hormone therapy, if any, is consistent with the NCAA existing policies on banned medications. So a female transitioning to a male via hormone therapy is no longer allowed to compete on the women's teams, but is eligible for the men's sports. And the same holds true if a male is transitioning into a female, into a female, and they have hormonal therapy that they're going through, then they would no longer be able to compete on the man's team, but they would be eligible to compete on the woman's team. Do you think that's fair? Are there any other rules that we could put into place? If you were on that team, how would you view this of your teammate? This all ties into socialization and also takes us into the social inequalities.